I land my best shot even on me, then it's over.
I had a deal. After the Stipe fight, I had a deal on the table for over $1 million, and then they announced the Crypto.com deal, and then the party pulled up.
What if the biggest fight in MMA history isn't happening inside the cage, but in court? Francis Ngannou, the man once crowned the most dangerous puncher on earth, has turned his gloves toward a new opponent, the very empire that made him famous. His $50 million lawsuit against the UFC isn't just another legal spat, it's an earthquake shaking the foundations of the entire sport. For years, fans watched him crush giants and hold the heavyweight belt with quiet dominance. But behind the bright lights of Las Vegas, something darker was brewing. Hidden clauses, missing millions, and a system designed to keep fighters dependent, all buried beneath glossy promos and corporate smiles. Now Ngannou has had enough. He's suing the UFC and its parent company TKO Holdings, claiming they built an empire off his back, muzzled his freedom, and erased his legacy when he walked away. The fallout is massive: leaked contracts, deleted highlights, and a billion-dollar organization suddenly on defense. Tonight we're peeling back the curtain. This isn't about fame or ego. It's about power, who really holds it, who's losing it, and why this courtroom battle might change the fight game forever. For Francis Ngannou, the moment everything snapped didn't come in the octagon, it came in a boardroom. After years of grinding through blood, sweat, and broken bones, he finally reached the top. Sponsors lined up. One deal in particular stood out: a $1.2 million contract with a global athletic brand that would have changed his family's future forever. Papers were ready, lawyers approved, and Francis was set to sign. Then overnight, it vanished. The reason the UFC had just inked an exclusive sponsorship deal with Crypto.com. Fighters were suddenly required to wear branded gear and banned from signing their own apparel or logo partnerships. Without warning, every athlete became a walking billboard for someone else's brand without seeing a cent of the revenue. Francis had done everything right, yet watched seven figures disappear before his eyes. He later recalled the moment in disbelief: "I had a deal on the table for over $1 million. Then the Crypto.com deal happened and they pulled out. That was the day the illusion shattered." The belt on his shoulder no longer felt like victory, it felt like a leash. He realized the company controlled not only his fights, but his freedom. Every sponsorship, every photo, every public appearance had to pass through their approval. The truth hit hard. He wasn't an independent athlete. He was an asset owned, managed, and monetized. All the power, all the fame, all the glory, but none of the control. That's when Francis realized he didn't own his success, someone else did. And that betrayal cut deeper than any punch he'd ever taken. Because this time, the fight wasn't about pride. It was about principle, and he was ready to swing back. When Francis Ngannou finally decided to study his UFC contract line by line, he wasn't looking for trouble, he was looking for understanding. But buried deep in the legal jargon, tucked between harmless-sounding phrases about extensions and promotional obligations, he found something that made his stomach drop. It was one line, just a few words, that changed everything. The clause stated that any adjustment to a fighter's agreement, including bonuses, rescheduled bouts, or sponsorship adjustments, would automatically renew the contract for an additional term. In plain English, that meant every time Francis accepted a small raise, a new fight date, or even a one-time bonus, the clock started over. He wasn't renegotiating, he was re-signing without even realizing it.
They let you pretend that you're negotiating while you're not negotiating, because either way, you're still in the contract.
To the public, UFC fighters looked like independent athletes, free to negotiate, free to walk. But in reality, they were trapped in what insiders now call rolling renewals, a corporate loop that kept them bound indefinitely. The more they fought, the longer they stayed locked in. A system built to look fair, but engineered for control. Francis once described it perfectly. By 20 months, they come back to renegotiate a little more money. You say yes, and suddenly it's a new 40 months. You never really get out. That was the hidden secret of the empire, the illusion of freedom, masking a cage made of paper and ink. The same man who fought monsters in the cage was now staring down a monster he couldn't punch, a system designed to own him legally, not physically. And once Francis saw that, he knew he had to fight back. Because if he didn't, the next generation of fighters would inherit the same invisible chains and never even know they were wearing them. Once the lawsuit became public, the first shockwave wasn't the dollar amount, it was the evidence. Attached to the filing were dozens of internal emails, text messages, and memos between UFC executives. They weren't rumors anymore. They were receipts. And among them was one phrase that fans couldn't believe came from the top: Ngannou is a risky investment. We need to devalue him before he gets ideas. That line alone told the story of an empire built not just on promotion but manipulation. The leaked communications revealed a calculated strategy: delay renegotiations, let public interest fade, then re-sign fighters for less once their market value cooled. It wasn't about competition, it was about control. In one message allegedly sent to UFC matchmaker Hunter Campbell, an executive wrote, "We can't match outside offers, but if we stall until next quarter, leverage disappears." Another discussed how contract freezes could be used as pressure, postponing fights until a fighter's finances strained, forcing them to accept whatever deal was left on the table. To Francis, the pattern was clear. The UFC wasn't protecting its brand, it was protecting its hierarchy. Every fighter who gained too much influence risked being quietly sidelined, smeared, or erased. The machine had one rule: no one man could be bigger than the logo on the cage. Ngannou had seen manipulation inside the ring, but this was different. It wasn't a referee, a judge, or an opponent, it was the system itself. And as the leaked documents spread online, fans began asking the same question Francis once did: how much power do fighters really have? The answer was simple as much as the machine allowed, but Francis was done asking. He was ready to expose it. When Francis Ngannou's legal team released the first set of financial comparisons, the MMA world froze. The numbers didn't just raise eyebrows, they exposed a system built on imbalance. During the years Francis held the heavyweight belt, the UFC's total revenue exceeded $1 billion annually. Yet fighters, the very people bleeding in the cage, received less than 18% of that amount. To put it in perspective, athletes in the NFL take home roughly 48% of league revenue. In boxing, fighters often earn 60% or more from each event. But in the UFC, even world champions sometimes walked away with a fraction of what they generated. Francis once said bluntly, "You can sell out an arena headline, a pay-per-view, and still go home wondering how to pay your coaches." Times more. This wasn't...
You're kind of like broke, you're struggling, and then you're seeing your next fight, okay, 50,000, you have to pay this and pay that and get away with maybe 20,000, and you have to pay your loan and all the stuff, and they have a new contract, 100,000. It's really hard to turn that down when you're in that position. By 20 months, they will come to negotiate. A little bit more money if you say yes, yeah. Then they are giving you a new 40 months, which means they start over because of that, because of the money that they add.
This wasn't poverty, it was the illusion of wealth. Fighters got just enough to feel successful, but never enough to feel free. They were handed flashy bonuses, new cars, or short-term contracts that looked like rewards, but those were golden handcuffs. The more they accepted, the tighter the grip became. The empire knew exactly how to keep its stars loyal, not by fairness, but by dependence. Behind the cameras, the UFC's profit margins soared nearly 50%, one of the highest in all professional sports. Meanwhile, fighters were told to be grateful, to stay humble, to trust the process. But when Francis started seeing those numbers side by side, the gratitude turned into disbelief. He had risked his life for an organization that paid executives more in annual bonuses than fighters made in their entire careers. The math didn't lie, it screamed exploitation. But Francis wasn't done counting, he started digging. When Francis Ngannou walked away from the UFC, he didn't expect applause, but he didn't expect to vanish either. Within weeks of his exit, fans noticed something eerie. His name, once synonymous with destruction, began disappearing from the UFC's digital universe. No more highlight reels, no clips of his thunderous knockouts, no mention in anniversary videos or greatest moments montages. It was as if the man who once ruled the octagon had never existed. On social media, longtime fans started piecing it together. Where's Ngannou became a trending question. The UFC didn't answer, but insiders later revealed that internal memos had circulated to phase out his image from official marketing. Merchandise was quietly discontinued. Search results on the UFC's website were scrubbed. It wasn't coincidence, it was a coordinated blackout. Sports analysts had a name for it: brand extermination, the corporate equivalent of character death. The goal wasn't just to punish Francis, it was to rewrite the narrative. If fans stopped seeing him, they'd stop missing him. If his victories were forgotten, his rebellion would lose its meaning. But the plan backfired. Every missing clip, every edited promo only amplified the truth. The UFC wasn't just erasing a fighter, it was erasing a legacy. For Francis, that realization cut deeper than any loss inside the cage. He had built his name punch by punch, fight by fight, year by year. Now it was being deleted by people who never took a single hit. They didn't just erase his name, one commentator said. They tried to erase his legacy. And yet in trying to silence him, they gave his story more power. Because you can delete a video, but you can't delete a movement. If the UFC wanted to hurt Francis Ngannou quietly, Dana White had other plans. Within days of Francis announcing his new deal with the PFL, Dana went on camera with that familiar smirk, dismissing it all as nonsense fashion. He called,
based on what I know about the deal, which is not much, it makes no sense to me. I mean, you're gonna pay a guy not to fight for a year, and it's already been like 18 months.
He called the contract stupid, claimed Francis was afraid to take risks, and joked that he'd rather not fight than face John Jones. The clip spread fast, replayed across every sports network. But behind the jokes was something more dangerous, a narrative designed to kill Francis's credibility. Ngannou's team fired back almost immediately, accusing Dana and the UFC of defamation and retaliation. The damage was real. Within weeks, 3 of Francis's sponsors, including one international fitness brand, backed out of pending deals worth over $3 million combined. One of them cited negative media attention directly tied to Dana's remarks. For a fighter who'd finally broken free, the Empire was making sure freedom came at a cost. Then came the leaks. Text messages between executives began surfacing conversations where UFC officials discussed devaluing Francis's public image, ensuring his marketability died off naturally. Another message reportedly read, "If he wants to play hero, let him do it broke." It was more than pettiness, it was punishment. A warning to every fighter watching: step out of line and the system will erase your opportunities one by one. But if Dana's goal was silence, he forgot who he was dealing with. Francis had survived far worse than PR warfare. He'd fought poverty, politics, and pain and come out stronger every time. So while the UFC tried to bury him under headlines and rumors, Francis was already preparing his counterpunch. Because silence was never his style. At first, Francis Ngannou stood alone, one man daring to take on the biggest organization in combat sports. But soon, the silence started to break. From the corners of the fight world, familiar names began to speak up. Nate Diaz tweeted, "He ain't lying." Georges St-Pierre, one of the UFC's most respected legends, publicly supported Francis's claims about restrictive contracts. Even Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, long praised for his calm professionalism, admitted he'd seen the same patterns. The message was clear: Francis wasn't crazy. He was right, and they all knew it. Behind closed doors, lawyers began to whisper about something bigger, a potential class action lawsuit involving multiple former champions and top contenders. Fighters who once feared retaliation were now sharing documents, payment logs, and contract copies. They realized what Francis had uncovered wasn't an isolated injustice, it was a system-wide blueprint. Then came the whistleblower. A former UFC accountant turned over internal spreadsheets allegedly showing that fighter pay was being reclassified to make the numbers look smaller. Bonuses were counted as marketing expenses. Pay-per-view profits were split across subsidiaries, so fighter percentages appeared lower. On paper, the books were clean. In reality, millions had quietly disappeared. As one source put it, they turned profit into paperwork. These revelations hit the MMA community like an aftershock. For years, fighters had been told to stay grateful. Now they were realizing they'd been shortchanged, and the walls were beginning to crack. The illusion of loyalty, the fear of speaking up, the myth of independence, all of it was starting to crumble. The whispers had become voices. The voices were becoming an army. The cracks were spreading and the empire was shaking. When Francis Ngannou's lawsuit hit the headlines, it wasn't just the UFC that took a hit, it was Wall Street. Within 24 hours, TKO Holdings, the parent company of both UFC and WWE, saw its stock price plunge nearly 9%, wiping out more than $1 billion in market value. Investors panicked. Analysts called it the most significant legal threat in MMA history. Suddenly, the empire built on fight night profits and highlight reels looked vulnerable. Behind the scenes, sponsors began pulling back. Crypto.com, once the UFC's crown jewel partner, quietly suspended new marketing campaigns pending legal clarification. Several apparel and beverage brands followed suit, terrified their logos might get caught in the crossfire. For the first time, the UFC's financial armor built on global partnerships started to crack. The media, usually tame when it came to criticizing Dana White, shifted tone overnight. ESPN and BT Sport began airing both sides of the story, balancing UFC highlights with reports about the lawsuit's accusations. Commentators who once parroted the company line now ask tough questions on air. If the fighters don't get paid fairly, who's really winning here? Inside Endeavor's Beverly Hills headquarters, chaos replaced confidence. Emergency meetings filled the calendar. PR teams drafted containment directives ordering executives to stay off record-limit interviews and avoid spontaneous press comments. Leaked memos showed the new motto, "Control the message, contain the damage." But the damage was already out there, spreading across social media faster than any fight clip ever had. For the first time, fans weren't cheering the UFC, they were questioning it. And in that silence, the silence of executive sponsors and broadcasters, Francis made his next move. As the UFC scrambled to contain the fallout, another power quietly entered the ring, and it wasn't another fight promotion. Reports began surfacing that Saudi investors, the same force that disrupted golf and boxing, were in talks to back a new athlete-owned MMA league. The idea was revolutionary fighters would hold equity share profits and finally control their own image rights. And at the center of it all was Francis Ngannou, the man who had just dared to challenge the system. Rumors spread that TKO Holdings had offered him a $70 million settlement to drop the lawsuit and sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. But Francis refused. For him, this was no longer about money, it was about meaning. They can buy silence, he told his lawyer, but not truth. Instead, he went on offense. His team launched a public website called Fighter Justice, releasing redacted excerpts from UFC contracts and internal memos that exposed the mechanics of control. Clauses that allowed the company to own fighter likeness in perpetuity. Rules that blocked personal sponsorships. Even non-compete terms that extended long after contracts ended. The internet exploded. Fighters fans and journalists flooded social media with the hashtag #WhyIFighterJustice demanding change. Former champions praised his courage. Younger fighters thanked him for risking everything they couldn't. For the first time, the balance of power began to tilt. The rebellion had started not in a cage, but online. And in the middle of it stood Francis Ngannou, calm, defiant, and unbought. The man the UFC tried to silence was now leading a global conversation about fairness, freedom, and respect. They could erase his highlights, his posters, even his name, but they couldn't erase the truth. When the courtroom doors finally opened in Nevada, it didn't feel like a legal hearing. It felt like a revolution. Reporters packed every seat. Cameras flashed as Francis Ngannou walked in not in fight gear, but in a black suit, calm and composed. The same composure that once terrified opponents now radiated across a room full of lawyers, executives, and global media. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about one man's paycheck. It was about whether fighters should be treated as employees with rights, healthcare, and bargaining power, or independent contractors bound by corporate contracts. It was about transparency, forcing the UFC to open its books and reveal how much money really flows through the sport. And it was about freedom, the right for athletes to own their likeness, control sponsorships, and build their own brand without fear of punishment. But the ripple effects reached far beyond the octagon. Legal experts warned that a ruling in Francis's favor could shake the entire combat sports industry, from WWE performers, long classified the same way, to boxers under restrictive promotional deals. If the court sided with Francis, it could redefine what it means to be a professional fighter in the modern era. Inside the courtroom, the UFC's silence was deafening. For once, they weren't dictating the narrative, they were defending it. And as the world watched, Francis didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He looked like a man rewriting history. Because he may have left the UFC, but he didn't walk away from the fight. He redefined it, turning one man's struggle for respect into a movement that could change combat sports forever.